Okay, so in terms of poster design, just a brief history. And so this poster here is done by a guy called Charest in 1890. Sorry, I'm going to get it now. This is 1879 in Paris. And so he's pretty much seen as the father of posters, of the art form, which is a relatively small, and it's not a flyer, so it's not something you hand out, it's something you stick up against the wall, so it has a specific size to it. And the reason is that he was a father was that a whole lot of things came together. In part, it was who he was, and to some extent the artist that he was, but it was also just the fact that technology at that point had got to a certain point where it was much easier to print large numbers of posters, and so it became a viable medium to actually disseminate information, to advertise products. And so we must also remember that most visual communications are actually used to sell us stuff and to sell us services. A small percentage of visual communication that we come across every day is about wanting to make us better citizens, wanting to make us get involved in programs that are going to do good for our communities. A very small part of it is about us voting for political parties. If anything, we know that really only kind of happens over an election period. And so the vast majority is products, services, and in this instance, a show. All right, just to speak to what the developments were. And so in order to make it easy to be able to print lots of posters, something happened in art where we flattened the image. And so up until this point you had images that were very realistic. Artists attempted really hard to paint paintings that reflected what they saw, the real world. And so what starts happening here to simplify that process and to make it easier to print those kind of images, we flatten the images so they become bigger shapes that is just one color. There's no shading, there's no weird lights, there's no shadows. And so you flatten the surface and make it into bigger shapes. And that's interesting because it then filters through, and other poster designers, simply because that's how they have to work, start doing that. So it's a very flat surface, the background is flat too, there's not real dimension, okay? And what's interesting here is, so this is by a guy called Toulouse-Lautrec, also still in Paris. And then you have Picasso, that's exposed to the work of Toulouse-Lautrec before he comes to Paris from Spain. And he references the poster in his artwork. So this is called the Blue Room, the painting. And so it starts speaking then about the power of posters is that they can actually also start informing art movements and how we actually start seeing the world and engage with the world. And so that takes us here again. So this is how poster design ultimately informed artworks. This is again by Picasso. It's a painting called Guernica. It's a massive mural. He did it for the Spanish Pavilion in 1936. And it speaks to civil war in Spain. So if you come and look at the details, it's grotesque. It really kind of shows the harsh realities of what war looks like. But again, it's flattened. And so it shows how poster design to some extent might have informed the ultimate style that Picasso adopted. With poster design, as an art, there are movements. So if we actually had to look back in history, and we had to look at posters from a specific time, they would have similar elements in them. And so here we have this one again from Charest, from 1879. And this kind of starts speaking to a new movement that was emerging called Art Nouveau. So you look at the kind of squiggly figures, you look at the very pointed toes. And so what Art Nouveau was doing, and very often art and art movements are a response to what's happening in society. So the Art Nouveau movement that starts referencing was a response to massive industrialization in Europe. So you had a massive growth in cities, you had a massive growth in the number of factories, of coal power, steam engines, And it's also the first time that you have a mass urbanization, so lots and lots of people moving to urban centers. And this actually resulted in very horrible conditions. So there was soot everywhere, grime, the coal that they were burning, literally the walls would all be black in here. That was the state, for instance, in London. Conditions of housing were awful, so all of a sudden you're also bringing a whole lot of people together. To some extent, what some of our communities are experiencing. The world is moving towards cities. The way in which they're moving isn't planned, it isn't orchestrated, it's haphazard. And so all of a sudden you have lots of people, you have limited services, and that results in bad living conditions. And so this is a major departure from the medieval times that would have preceded this a bit, and the Renaissance specifically, where things were more idyllic and romanticized looking back. People lived on farms, they plowed the lands, they saved up seeds for the winter. It was rural, it was pretty, was the sense. It was not always the case, but looking back, you kind of then have that sense. Standing in London in like the late 1800s, grimy, dirty city, and then you think of that, on the farms, how beautiful. And so the Art Nouveau movement was an attempt to take us back to that point. So it was about sinuous lines, about vines and leaves. It was about femininity, so it was the female form, very sensuous, very beautiful. And this was all an attempt to take us back, to speak to an earlier time, because the artists of the time didn't like the reality that they were faced with. Okay? And then this poster, Abolish the Pass Laws, was published by the Communist Party of South Africa in the 1940s, late 1940s. And so this is after the Second World War. No. Sorry, it might have been in between. I think it's actually in between, sorry. In between the First and the Second World War. And these are big defining moments in European history, but they also have impacts globally. So after the First War, you started having industry in the 1800s, and now you're moving to a point where production has increased, factories are becoming more efficient, and the war effort really did make a whole lot of things more efficient. So radios, for instance, and radio technology developed very quickly over that period. And the machines with which to make the first rudimentary planes that were used in the First World War and then building towards the Second World War, all of a sudden means that like technology and the ability to bend metal, for instance, in interesting and new innovative ways has improved. And so you can start having very geometric shapes. You get stainless steel, and you can bend the stainless steel pipes into fantastic furniture, into beautiful chairs. And this then means that then starts getting reflected in posters. So we move towards geometric shapes, circles, squares, rectangles, perfect curves. And that's ultimately known as the Art Deco movement. And again, because it fell after the Second World War, there was a moment of hope too. The First World War at that point was known as the war to end all wars. The League of Nations had been started, which was the precursor to the United Nations. And so there was a hopefulness that industry, that technology was going to mean that society would get better and that we'd be able to move past those differences that resulted in the First World War.